Long before the familiar names of Greece and Rome, before the pyramids of Egypt were raised toward the heavens, there was a land between two rivers. Mesopotamia, the name itself comes from ancient Greek, meaning between rivers, was nestled gently between the Tigris and Euphrates in what is now modern-day Iraq, along with parts of Syria, Kuwait, and Turkey. These rivers, fed by seasonal rains and snowmelt from the mountains to the north, carved through the land like twin veins, delivering lifeblood. Their yearly floods brought with them silt and nutrients, creating a rich, fertile basin in the midst of otherwise dry, sweeping plains. And it was here, in this gentle geography of water and soil, that humanity first began to build not just settlements, but civilization. The Tigris and Euphrates were not always calm. Their waters could be unpredictable, flooding violently or drying up in times of drought. But it was precisely in this tension between opportunity and risk that the first farmers learned to harness the power of nature. Early communities, likely drawn to the dependable richness of the river banks, began cultivating wheat and barley, domesticating sheep and goats, and digging the earliest irrigation canals. With each passing season, they became less reliant on the wild and more capable of shaping the world around them. Villages expanded, families grew, surplus food made trade possible, and trade, in turn, made cities inevitable. This corner of the world, part of the broader arc known as the Fertile Crescent, is often described as the cradle of civilization. Its soil bore witness to a series of firsts in human history: the first true cities, the first formal governments, the first written language, and the first legal codes. In Mesopotamia, the most basic threads of organized society, law, literature, mathematics, and theology, were spun and woven together in patterns that still echo in the modern world. It was not a single kingdom or culture that accomplished this, but rather a series of remarkable peoples: Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians. Each rose and fell, building upon the legacy of those who came before. One cannot speak of Mesopotamia without marveling at its lasting contributions. Writing began here in the form of cuneiform, wedge-shaped marks etched onto clay tablets, not as art, but as necessity. As temples managed surpluses and scribes tracked trades, symbols became tools of administration. Over time, those tools evolved into chronicles, myths, poems, and prayers. Law emerged too, most famously in the Code of Hammurabi, one of the earliest recorded legal systems which carved justice into stone, an eye for an eye. The cities themselves, Uruk, Babylon, grew into powerful centers of administration, religion, and culture. Ziggurats, their towering temple complexes, reached skyward like man-made mountains. Trade routes stretched outward, armies defended and conquered, stories were told and retold, including the oldest known epic in human history, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and yet, for all their grandeur, the peoples of Mesopotamia were also deeply aware of their fragility. The rivers could shift, empires could crumble, the gods could be displeased. Time itself, for them, was a cycle of rise and fall, of kings and floods, of remembrance and forgetting. Their myths, their calendars, even their city plans reflected this understanding of life as both fleeting and divine. Today, much of what we know about Mesopotamia comes not from grand ruins alone, but from the quiet diligence of archaeologists, translators, and historians who have pieced together the past from fragments of clay. In libraries, in museums, and in buried ziggurats, the stories of this ancient world are whispered still. We hear them in the principles of law that shape our courts. We see them in the structure of our cities. We feel them in the written word, the calendar, the idea that time can be measured and organized. As you settle in for this journey through ancient Mesopotamia, imagine yourself drifting along the Tigris at twilight, the air warm and silent, the reeds swaying along the banks. The stars begin to glow above, just as they did thousands of years ago when the first astronomers recorded their positions. Somewhere nearby, a scribe presses symbols into a wet clay tablet. A priest tends the sacred flame. A farmer checks the channels for tomorrow's watering. And from these small acts, patient, steady, and enduring, the world's first civilization quietly rises. Long before temples rose above city walls and kings etched their decrees in stone, Mesopotamia was a wild and open land, shaped not by empires, but by wind, water, and time. In the quiet aftermath of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago, the earth was beginning to warm. Glaciers retreated, rivers swelled with meltwater, and the climate slowly shifted from harsh and frigid to something gentler, more forgiving. This change, though gradual, brought about one of the most profound transformations in human history: the transition from nomadic hunter-gatherers to settled farming communities, a change we now call the Neolithic Revolution. The Ice Age had held much of the world in its grip for millennia, and its thawing marked the beginning of an age of experimentation. In Mesopotamia, this warming created a more stable environment, with longer growing seasons and richer plant and animal life. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers meandered through fertile plains, occasionally flooding and leaving behind nutrient-rich silt, a natural fertilizer that would become central to agriculture. The unpredictable rains of the past gave way to a more predictable rhythm, and with it came opportunity. Humans began to take notice of the edible plants that thrived near their seasonal camps. They learned which seeds sprouted after the rains, which roots nourished best, and how to shape the wild into something manageable. This period of transition was not sudden. For thousands of years, humans lived in a kind of hybrid rhythm, hunting and foraging in the wild while tentatively cultivating certain plants and domesticating animals. In time, the balance began to shift. Instead of moving to follow herds or wild grains, people began to stay in one place and bring the food to them. This was not merely a change in diet, it was a change in worldview. With agriculture came permanence. With permanence came houses, granaries, tools, and new ways of living together. By around 10,000 BCE, in various pockets of the Fertile Crescent, communities began to emerge that were no longer fully nomadic. These early settlements, though simple, marked a profound departure from the past. One of the oldest known examples is Jericho, located in modern-day Palestine, not technically in Mesopotamia proper, but part of the broader Fertile Crescent. Jericho boasted stone walls, a watchtower, and evidence of organized society as early as 9000 BCE. Slightly to the east, in the Zagros foothills of modern Iraq, archaeologists uncovered the village of Jarmo. Dated to around 7000 BCE, Jarmo gives us a more direct glimpse into the Mesopotamian region's shift into agrarian life. Here, people lived in mud brick houses, cultivated wheat and barley, and raised domesticated animals such as goats, pigs, and sheep. The shift to agriculture did more than fill granaries. It reshaped the very fabric of daily life. People now needed to coordinate planting and harvesting, store food for the seasons, and defend their surpluses from rivals. With time, this meant organizing labor, forming rules, and relying on shared rituals to maintain social cohesion. The land itself demanded attention. Irrigation, the channeling of river water into fields, would soon become central to Mesopotamian success. But even these earliest farmers had to dig, guide, and maintain water sources to ensure crops would flourish. Wheat and barley were the twin pillars of the Mesopotamian diet, easy to grow in the floodplain soil and reliable sources of energy. Alongside them, legumes like lentils and chickpeas added variety and nutrients. Goats and sheep provided milk, meat, and wool. With domesticated animals, farming families could plow fields more efficiently and carry goods farther than before. Over generations, these changes compounded, producing more food than any one family needed. This surplus allowed for specialization, the birth of artisans, potters, weavers, and traders. The Neolithic revolution in Mesopotamia laid not just the groundwork for agriculture, but the scaffolding for civilization itself. Settled life meant larger populations. Larger populations required leadership, cooperation, and planning. The seeds of writing, of religion, of law, all were sown in this age of quiet but irreversible change. And while no great monuments remain from these earliest farmers, their legacy lives in every organized society that followed. So as we drift deeper into Mesopotamia's long and layered story, we begin not with emperors or armies, but with the humble shift of a hand, planting a seed, shaping a furrow, tending a goat. A quiet beginning, perhaps, but one that would shape the course of human history. As the Neolithic age unfolded across the Fertile Crescent, the scattered bands of hunter-gatherers who once wandered the plains began to anchor themselves to place. This shift, slow and uneven, gave rise to the first permanent human settlements, modest clusters of homes that marked humanity's earliest attempts at village life. Among these pioneering sites, two stand out as especially significant: Jericho and Jarmo. Though separated by distance and time, each reveals the quiet ingenuity of people learning to shape the land around them. Jericho, nestled near the Jordan River and the Dead Sea, is often described as the world's oldest continually inhabited city. Archaeological evidence suggests people began settling here as early as 9000 BCE. What made Jericho remarkable was not only its age, but its scale and complexity. Excavations reveal circular dwellings made from mud brick set around courtyards and, most strikingly, massive stone walls. These early walls, complete with a watchtower standing over 20 feet tall, suggest that even in its infancy, human society was grappling with the twin challenges of defense and cooperation. Jericho's early residents had tapped into one of the most important features of the Neolithic revolution: a stable water source. Springs near the settlement provided fresh water, and fertile soils made early agriculture possible. Here, the people cultivated barley and wheat, not as wild grasses to be foraged, but as crops to be planted, tended, and stored. These grains would become staples of Mesopotamian agriculture for millennia, sustaining not only daily life, but also shaping rituals, trade, and even taxation. To the east, in the Zagros foothills of what is now northern Iraq, another settlement took shape around 7000 BCE. This was Jarmo, a small but vital Neolithic village that provides one of the clearest windows into early Mesopotamian life. Discovered in the mid-20th century, Jarmo yielded an abundance of clues, from tools and pottery to food remains and housing structures, about how early agricultural communities functioned. Its inhabitants lived in small rectangular homes made from packed mud with thatched roofs and shared spaces. The community was not large, perhaps a few dozen families, but it was stable, self-sufficient, and part of a growing network of early settlements across the region. What both Jericho and Jarmo demonstrate is that once humans settled, they began to experiment, not just with how they lived, but with what they ate and how they worked the land. Domestication in this context was not a single discovery, but a centuries-long relationship between humans and their environment. Wild grains like wheat and barley were gathered, planted, and selectively bred for their favorable traits. Over generations, plants with fuller seed heads and shorter stalks, easier to harvest and less prone to scattering, became dominant. These were the ancestors of the wheat and barley that would feed Mesopotamian empires centuries later. The same process occurred with animals. Sheep and goats, once hunted in the hills and grasslands, were increasingly corralled, fed, and bred for their utility. These animals offered more than meat. Goats provided milk, which could be stored and turned into cheese or yogurt. Sheep gave wool for weaving. Both produced dung, which early farmers began to use to fertilize fields, a vital innovation in sustaining agriculture. Over time, the animals themselves changed. Domesticated breeds became smaller, more docile, and more reliant on human care. Traits that, ironically, also made them more valuable to their keepers. These domesticated grains and animals became the economic backbone of early Mesopotamian life. They enabled people to survive poor seasons and plan for the future. They also introduced new challenges. Farming required organization: when to plant, when to harvest, how to divide the labor. It required tools, sickles for grain, pens for livestock, and it required rules: who owned what land, who got the surplus, who kept the seed. In these necessities, we see the earliest glimmers of social order, even government. By anchoring themselves to the land, the people of Jericho and Jarmo unknowingly set in motion a cascade of innovations. Over the centuries, their descendants would build canals to guide river waters, develop markets for trade, and raise temples to honor the forces they believed governed their crops and flocks. But it began here, with a few mud brick homes, with grain heads gathered from a field, with a goat tethered just beyond the hearth. This chapter of human history is not marked by empires or battles, but by quiet persistence. In the gentle turn from wildness to cultivation, these early communities gave birth to something entirely new. The idea of a home not just for a season, but for generations. The seeds they planted, quite literally, would grow into the roots of civilization. In the quiet murmur of history's earliest chapters, a new kind of human settlement began to emerge, vastly different from the simple villages of Jericho or Jarmo. As the Neolithic gave way to the Chalcolithic, and then the early Bronze Age, human beings began to cluster together in greater numbers, building complex societies that would eventually form cities. And nowhere was this transformation more profound than in southern Mesopotamia, where the Sumerians laid the foundations for the first urban civilization. The Sumerians, whose origins remain shrouded in mystery, began settling in the southernmost reaches of Mesopotamia around 4000 BCE. Whether they migrated into the region or developed in place from earlier groups is still debated, but their impact is unmistakable. Unlike the scattered, kin-based settlements of earlier millennia, the Sumerians brought with them a new model of life, organized, expansive, and highly interdependent. They did not simply live on the land. They reshaped it. Southern Mesopotamia, known as Sumer, was both a blessing and a challenge. The land was flat and fertile, but lacked stone, timber, and reliable rainfall. The rivers, Tigris and Euphrates, were generous but unruly, flooding unpredictably. To thrive in this environment, the Sumerians had to engineer solutions. They dug canals, built levees, and constructed reservoirs, mastering the art of irrigation on a scale never before seen. This allowed for surplus agriculture, enough food not only to feed a growing population, but to support priests, artisans, laborers, and administrators. At the heart of this transformation stood Uruk, which by 3500 BCE had grown into what many scholars consider the world's first true city. Sprawling across hundreds of acres and housing tens of thousands of people, Uruk was unlike anything that had come before. It had monumental architecture, administrative districts, and residential zones. There were workshops for potters and metal workers, storage houses for grain, and temples that rose above the flat plains like staircases to the heavens. These temples were ziggurats, massive terraced platforms of mud brick that dominated the skyline. They were not simply places of worship, but centers of economic and political power. Atop them sat shrines dedicated to deities like Inanna, the goddess of love and war, or Anu, the sky god. Below, within the temple complexes, goods were collected, redistributed, and recorded. These sacred structures symbolized the belief that the divine and civic realms were one and the same, that the city's order was a reflection of the god's will. Uruk and cities like it were not governed by kings in the way later empires would be. Instead, early on, rule was often in the hands of priest-kings or temple elites, who maintained social harmony by managing rituals, agricultural planning, and communal labor. Yet, as populations swelled and rivalries intensified, secular rulers began to emerge. Thus, each major settlement, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Eridu, and others, functioned as a city-state, with its own deity, laws, and ruler. The emergence of these independent city-states marked a new era in human organization. They frequently clashed over water rights, trade routes, and political influence, but they also exchanged ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. This intercity dynamic spurred innovation, particularly in irrigation. Extensive canal networks allowed farmers to direct river water with precision, supporting both subsistence crops like barley and luxury items like dates and flax. It also enabled year-round agriculture in an otherwise arid region. With surplus food came specialization. Not everyone needed to farm, so new professions emerged. Artisans crafted intricate pottery and tools, traders moved goods along the rivers and overland routes, scribes began to develop proto-writing systems to track transactions and offerings. Society grew more stratified, with laborers at the base, priests and elites above, and administrators in between. Even crime and punishment became institutionalized. Early records detail fines, disputes over property, and rules for contracts. And all of this was anchored in the city, a new kind of human home, dense with activity, buzzing with ritual, shaped by human hands and divine symbols alike. Uruk, with its temple to Inanna, its administrative buildings, and its complex infrastructure, was more than just a collection of buildings. It was an organism, living, evolving, adapting, a place where myths took shape, laws were born, and the written word began its long journey. As we drift deeper into the story of Mesopotamia, it is here, in the sun-baked bricks of Uruk and the echo of its canals, that we begin to feel the true pulse of civilization. These early cities were not merely shelters. They were expressions of collective will, sustained by water, labor, and belief, an enduring testament to what humans can build when they gather, dream, and organize. In the soft clay of ancient Mesopotamia, a quiet revolution took place, one not of armies or kings, but of symbols, impressions, and the delicate scratch of a stylus. Around 3200 BCE, amid the buzzing activity of temples and storehouses in cities like Uruk and Ur, the Sumerians gave birth to something that would forever change the human experience: writing. This was not writing as we understand it today, with alphabets and flowing sentences, but cuneiform, named for the wedge-shaped impressions made in soft clay using a sharpened reed stylus. At first, cuneiform was a purely practical tool. The earliest tablets we've recovered were records, inventories of grain, sheep, fish, and labor. Accountants and temple administrators needed a reliable way to track the growing complexity of city life. As the economies of these early cities grew, so too did the need for record-keeping. How many bushels of barley had been delivered? Who had paid their temple tax? What laborer owed what to whom? Memory alone was no longer sufficient. Clay tablets, once dried or fired, became durable repositories of truth. The earliest forms of cuneiform were pictographic, simple drawings that represented objects or ideas. But as usage expanded, the system evolved into something more abstract. Over time, pictographs gave way to phonetic symbols representing sounds and syllables. This shift allowed scribes to move beyond mere record-keeping. They began composing legal codes, prayers, hymns, contracts, treaties, and, eventually, literature. With this evolution, Sumerian became one of the first languages to be captured in permanent written form. Scribes became essential members of society. Educated in specialized schools, often attached to temples, they spent years mastering the intricate system of over 600 signs. Their work granted continuity to institutions, legitimized kings, and connected generations through the written word. Tablets were stored in temple archives and palace libraries, and while many were functional, ledgers, lists, receipts, others ventured into the realm of the mythic, the poetic, and the eternal. Out of this expanding literary tradition emerged one of humanity's oldest surviving stories, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Composed sometime between 2100 and 1200 BCE, though drawing on even older oral traditions, this epic follows the adventures of Gilgamesh, a historical king of Uruk who became, in myth, something far greater. 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, a ruler burdened with questions no throne could answer. The Epic of Gilgamesh is not merely a tale of ancient heroism. It is a profound meditation on mortality, friendship, grief, and the search for meaning. It begins with Gilgamesh as a restless and arrogant king who, though mighty, brings unease to his people. To temper him, the gods create Enkidu, a wild man from the steppe who becomes Gilgamesh's closest companion. Together they slay monsters, challenge the gods, and undertake quests of daring and pride. But the story turns with tragedy. Enkidu falls ill and dies, and Gilgamesh, confronted for the first time with the finality of death, plunges into despair. He journeys across the known world in search of immortality, seeking out Utnapishtim, the survivor of a great flood who had been granted eternal life by the gods. Along the way, he encounters scorpion men, immortal barmaids, and ancient wisdom carved into stone. And though he briefly grasps the secret of everlasting life, it slips from him, stolen by a serpent, a creature symbolic of renewal and the cyclical nature of existence. In the end, Gilgamesh returns to Uruk. He does not find eternal life, but he does find a different kind of legacy. He looks upon the city's walls, strong, enduring, and built by his own hands, and understands that human achievements, though mortal, can echo across generations. The epic closes not with conquest, but with acceptance. It offers no easy answers, only the quiet truth that to be human is to live, to lose, and to remember. This ancient story was not hidden in a scroll or book, but etched onto clay tablets, preserved in the libraries of Nineveh and Babylon, and uncovered millennia later by archaeologists stunned by its emotional depth. Its echoes can be found in later traditions, from the biblical flood of Noah to Homeric epics, from philosophical inquiries into the nature of death, to modern novels exploring the weight of grief and friendship. Thus, from the clay of Mesopotamia rose not just cities and ziggurats, but words, permanent, enduring, shaped by hands long gone, but still speaking. The invention of writing and the stories it preserved allowed humanity to speak across the ages. And in Gilgamesh's mournful, majestic journey, we glimpse not only the first hero of literature, but the first mirror of our shared inner lives. In the still dawn of Sumerian civilization, the earliest people of Mesopotamia looked skyward and inward, searching for meaning in the rhythms of flood and drought, birth and death, chaos and order. From their questions emerged a spiritual tapestry as rich as the soil between the Tigris and Euphrates, a pantheon of deities, stories, and rituals that sought to explain not only the nature of the cosmos, but also the structure of human life. This worldview became the spiritual foundation of one of the world's first urban civilizations. At the heart of Sumerian belief was the idea that the universe was ordered and maintained by divine will. The gods were not distant or abstract figures. They were present in every force of nature and aspect of society. They built the world, governed it, and watched over it with inscrutable intentions. The pantheon was vast, but a few deities stood above the rest, forming a divine hierarchy that reflected the political order of Sumerian cities. An, the sky god, was the high father of the gods, the distant but all-encompassing figure who represented the infinite heavens above. Though not often involved in daily affairs, An's authority was absolute, and many kings traced their legitimacy to his divine approval. Enlil, god of wind and air, was perhaps the most powerful and active among the gods. Seen as the chief executive of divine authority, Enlil controlled the breath of life and the fate of cities. It was he who separated heaven and earth, and he who often intervened in human affairs, sending floods, granting kingship, or punishing hubris. His temple at Nippur was considered one of the most sacred sites in Sumer, a spiritual axis where divine and earthly power converged. Inanna, the goddess of love, war, fertility, and political power, was one of the most complex and beloved figures in the Sumerian pantheon. Revered for her beauty and feared for her wrath, Inanna embodied both creation and destruction, She could inspire harvests and spark battles with equal force. Her descent into the underworld, a myth rich with symbolism, represented the cycles of life and death, rebirth and renewal. Her temples, especially in the city of Uruk, were centers not only of worship, but of social and economic life. There were many other gods as well, each associated with cities, professions, and natural elements. Utu, the sun god and bringer of justice. Nana, the moon god who governed time and ritual. Enki, the wise god of fresh water and craft, who often acted as a trickster and benefactor of humanity. These deities were more than myth. They were woven into the calendar, the laws, the architecture, and the very identity of the people who worshipped them. Central to the Sumerian understanding of society was the belief that humans were created to serve the gods. This was not seen as punishment, but as divine purpose. In their myths, the gods themselves were burdened by labor, digging canals, raising ziggurats, and so they fashioned humanity from clay and divine blood to take over these tasks. Cities, therefore, were seen as gifts from the gods, and each city was governed under the watchful eye of its patron deity. To maintain this sacred balance, the Sumerians developed a system of governance where spiritual and temporal authority were deeply intertwined. At the head of each city-state was an ensi, a priest-king who served as the human intermediary between the people and the divine. The ensi was not simply a ruler, but a steward of the god's estate on earth. He performed rituals, managed temple economies, interpreted omens, and enforced divine law. Temples were not just places of worship, they were economic, political, and social centers. Massive ziggurats, terraced structures that rose above the plains, symbolized the connection between heaven and earth. Each layer of the ziggurat brought the priest closer to the sky, a physical ascent to the realm of the gods. Inside the temple complex, scribes tallied grain, artisans crafted offerings, and administrators oversaw land and labor. The temple owned fields, herds, workshops, and slaves. It was both sanctuary and state. In this system, religion and governance were inseparable. Every harvest was offered in part to the gods. Every military victory was attributed to divine favor. Every drought or plague was a sign of spiritual imbalance. The legitimacy of rulers depended on maintaining this cosmic order. And as the centuries passed, even as city-states warred and dynasties rose and fell, the gods endured, constant presences in the ever-turning wheel of Mesopotamian life. Thus, in Sumer, to live was to live under the gaze of the gods. The pantheon was not a distant myth, but a daily reality, reflected in the rising smoke of temple altars, the murmur of prayers in the ziggurat's shadows, and the solemn figure of the ensi, standing between earth and sky. To the people of ancient Sumer, the structure of life was not simply a social arrangement, it was an echo of divine order. Every field sown, every law passed, every temple built, was part of a sacred pattern woven by the gods. And at the center of that pattern stood the institution of kingship, seen not as a human invention, but as a heavenly mandate. Kingship, in Sumerian thought, was not permanent in any one city or lineage. Instead, it was bestowed by the gods, passed from one city to another as divine favor shifted. The Sumerians even preserved a document known as the Sumerian King List, which recorded the rulers of various cities in a kind of sacred chronology. It began with mythical kings who ruled for thousands of years before the Great Flood, suggesting that the idea of kingship stretched back to the very dawn of humanity. The key idea here was that kings did not rule by mere strength or wealth, but because the gods had chosen them to serve as caretakers of their divine order on earth. In this system, law was not abstract. It was rooted in cosmic principles established by the gods themselves. While later figures like Ur-Nammu or Hammurabi would inscribe formal codes of law, the underlying belief was already present in early Sumer, that justice, fairness, and the proper regulation of society were sacred duties. A good king was one who ensured me, a Sumerian term that referred to the divine decrees governing all aspects of existence, from social conduct to art, music, and trade. To violate the divine order was not simply a civic offense, it was an affront to the gods. Natural disasters, military defeats, or famines were seen as signs that rulers had strayed from their spiritual duties. Kings were therefore deeply involved in religious ritual. They consulted oracles, interpreted omens, and made offerings to keep the favor of the divine. In temples, their likenesses stood beside the gods, not as equals, but as humble servants chosen to carry out their will. But divine favor was fickle, and in the fractured landscape of southern Mesopotamia, city-states constantly competed for dominance under the watchful eyes of their patron deities. No sooner had one city risen to prominence than another would challenge its authority, claiming that the gods had now blessed them instead. This tension created a political world that was both dynamic and volatile. Among the most well-known rivalries were those between the city-states of Lagash, Kish, and Ur, each powerful in its own time and each claiming divine legitimacy. Kish, located in northern Sumer, was often associated with the beginnings of kingship itself. The phrase, "He made Kish his seat," was shorthand for a ruler establishing widespread power. For many centuries, the title King of Kish carried symbolic weight, even when the actual city no longer held dominance. Lagash, to the southeast, became notable for its reformist kings. One such figure, Uruk, is often credited with implementing early legal reforms around 2350 BCE. His inscriptions detail efforts to curb the corruption of temple officials, protect the poor, and restore just practices. Though the reforms were short-lived, they highlight a consciousness about justice and the responsibilities of power that ran deep in Sumerian kingship. Meanwhile, was a spiritual and economic powerhouse, with its grand ziggurat rising above the plains. It often served as a religious center, even when political control rested elsewhere. In the centuries that followed, would re-emerge as the heart of a new dynasty. But even in earlier times, it was a symbol of enduring cultural and divine importance. These rivalries weren't just battles of armies. They were ideological struggles, contests over which God favored which people and who had the right to organize the land in accordance with heaven's decrees. Wars were justified not merely by ambition, but by the assertion that a rival city had strayed from divine law. Victory was a sign that one city's gods, and by extension its people, were in alignment with the cosmic order. Despite the frequent warfare, the Sumerians shared a remarkable degree of cultural unity. Their language, writing system, religious beliefs, and administrative systems formed a common foundation. Even conquered cities were rarely destroyed outright. Instead, they were absorbed, their temples reconsecrated, and their rulers replaced with others who would claim the gods' favor anew. Through it all, the Sumerian kings walked a fine line, servants of the gods, but also wielders of immense power. Their authority depended on maintaining harmony between heaven and earth, between palace and temple, between law and ritual. It was a fragile balance, and history would show how easily it could be lost. Yet for centuries, the belief in divine kingship helped bind a diverse and competitive land into the first great experiment in urban civilization. As the early city-states of Sumer battled for dominance under the guidance of their gods and priest-kings, a new force began to rise in the northern reaches of Mesopotamia. In a region known as Akkad, its exact capital still a mystery lost to time, a remarkable figure emerged who would change the course of ancient history, Sargon the Great. Around 2300 BCE, Sargon carved out a new kind of rule in the ancient world, not merely as king of a city, but as emperor over many cities and peoples. His rise marked a dramatic shift in the nature of power in Mesopotamia. Instead of divine kingship limited to one city-state, Sargon envisioned an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. For the first time in recorded history, a single ruler unified the fertile south of Sumer with the lands to the north, founding what is often regarded as the world's first empire. Sargon's story is shrouded in legend, woven together from later inscriptions and Sumerian epics. According to one such tale, he was born of humble origins, placed in a reed basket and set afloat on a river to be discovered and raised by a gardener. This echo of later stories, such as that of Moses, reflects how Sargon's life quickly became mythologized even during his reign. Despite his modest beginnings, Sargon rose to serve under the king of Kish, eventually overthrowing his patron and taking control himself. He then launched a series of military campaigns that would bring the rich cities of Sumer under Akkadian control. His conquest was not merely a matter of force. Sargon understood the importance of legitimacy, and he took great care to present himself as chosen by the gods. He maintained the Sumerian religious institutions and continued to honor the great deities of the land, An, Enlil, and Inanna among them, while also introducing his own divine patron, Ishtar, the Akkadian counterpart to Inanna. By integrating rather than suppressing Sumerian culture, he established a foundation for long-term rule over a diverse population. Sargon's administration was highly organized. He stationed governors loyal to him in key cities, built a network of roads to connect the vast territory, and even created what is believed to be the first postal system, dispatching messages written on clay tablets throughout the empire. His army, a standing force supported by conscription and logistics, was one of the most professional of its time. This model would be replicated by later empires throughout history. But one of Sargon's most enduring legacies was not military or administrative. It was linguistic. As the Akkadian language spread across the empire, it began to supplant Sumerian in daily life, especially in the northern regions. Akkadian, a Semitic language related to Hebrew and Arabic, was more accessible to the broader population beyond Sumer. For centuries, it would become the lingua franca of diplomacy, trade, and governance throughout Mesopotamia and even beyond. Yet rather than erasing Sumerian, Akkadian coexisted with it for generations. Scribes were trained in both languages, and official inscriptions were often bilingual. Sumerian remained the language of religion and high culture, while Akkadian served the practical needs of empire. This dual tradition enriched Mesopotamian scholarship and ensured the survival of earlier cultural achievements. Sargon's reign lasted over half a century, and after his death, the Akkadian Empire continued under his descendants, most notably his grandson Naram-Sin. Naram-Sin would take the bold step of declaring himself a living god, a controversial move that tested the boundaries of divine kingship. But the seeds of instability were already being sown. While the empire had expanded rapidly, it faced constant challenges, local rebellions, difficulties in maintaining long-distance control, and environmental pressures that strained resources. Nevertheless, Sargon's achievement remained monumental. He had transformed a land of competing city-states into a single political entity. He had shown that power could be centralized and that the idea of empire stretching beyond tribal or city loyalties was not only possible but effective. The Akkadian Empire would not last forever, but its influence endured. Its model of governance, its embrace of linguistic diversity, and its blending of cultural traditions would echo throughout the ancient Near East for centuries. And Sargon himself would become a touchstone of legend, his name invoked by kings and conquerors long after his cities had fallen silent, his roads worn away by time, and his empire returned to the dust of the plains. In the next part, we will explore the internal mechanisms of this great empire, its army, its economy, and the eventual forces that brought it to its knees. At the height of its power, the Akkadian Empire not only stretched across the broad arc of Mesopotamia, but also brought forth innovations in governance and infrastructure that would define imperial rule for centuries. Among the most groundbreaking of these were the empire's pioneering efforts in state communication and military organization, systems that allowed the vast realm to be managed with surprising cohesion given its geographical and cultural diversity. The first known postal system in history is attributed to the Akkadians, specifically under the reign of Sargon the Great and his successors. In an age when clay tablets served as the primary medium for writing, this system relied on a vast network of roads and way stations that connected distant provinces to the imperial capital. Couriers, likely trusted officials or soldiers, carried clay tablets marked with seals of authority, delivering messages that ranged from royal decrees to tax records and logistical instructions. These early messengers formed the arteries of an imperial nervous system, allowing decisions made in the central palace to echo across the far reaches of the empire. In doing so, Sargon and his administrators forged the template for bureaucratic control over large territories, an approach that would be refined by later powers such as the Persians and Romans. Equally revolutionary was the establishment of a standing army. Unlike earlier city-states that assembled militias during times of war, the Akkadian military was a permanent and professional institution. Soldiers were trained and maintained year-round, equipped with bronze weapons and standardized gear. This consistency not only made Akkad's forces more formidable, but also allowed for rapid responses to rebellions, border threats, and ambitious expansions. Sargon's military was likely the first to use composite bows in organized formations, and to rely on a corps of engineers for siegecraft, including battering rams and rudimentary fortifications. Naram-Sin, the grandson of Sargon, took these military innovations further. His campaigns reached into the Zagros Mountains and even touched the edges of Anatolia, earning him the title King of the Four Quarters of the World. Yet his reign also introduced signs of imperial overreach. In his most controversial act, Naram-Sin declared himself a living god, an unprecedented move that defied Mesopotamian tradition, which held that kings ruled on behalf of the gods but were not divine themselves. This assertion of divinity alienated both religious authorities and political rivals, introducing tensions that simmered beneath the surface of imperial grandeur. Over time, the very mechanisms that made the empire powerful became its burdens. Maintaining a standing army required a steady supply of food, arms, and labor. The postal system, too, depended on functioning roads, security, and trust in centralized governance. As external pressures mounted, these systems began to fray. One of the earliest and most significant challenges came from the eastern north, invasions by mountain tribes such as the Gutians, a people from the Zagros highlands. The Gutians were not a unified empire, but rather a collection of tribal groups whose movements may have been prompted by environmental stress or conflict with neighboring peoples. Their raids destabilized northern Mesopotamian cities and eventually led to the occupation of parts of the Akkadian heartland. These incursions not only disrupted trade and agriculture, but also shattered the sense of invincibility that the empire had cultivated. Compounding this external threat were signs of ecological stress. Pollen data and sediment analyses suggest that Mesopotamia experienced a period of severe drought around 2200 BCE, coinciding with the collapse of the Akkadian Empire. The once reliable Tigris and Euphrates rivers may have suffered from reduced flow, leading to failed harvests and economic hardship. Irrigation systems, dependent on regular maintenance and water levels, likely fell into disrepair, accelerating the decline in agricultural productivity. As food shortages grew, so did internal unrest. Provinces that once yielded grain and tribute now resisted central authority. Rebellions flared in key cities such as and Lagash, where local rulers sought to reassert independence from Akkadian control. The central government, strained by war and famine, found itself unable to project power with the same confidence it once did. Eventually, the Akkadian Empire disintegrated under the combined weight of invasions, climate shifts, and internal revolts. The proud line of rulers descended into obscurity, and the once glorious capital, its location still undiscovered, vanished beneath the sands of time. The Gutians ruled for a period but failed to establish the same administrative sophistication, and Mesopotamia entered a phase of fragmentation and regionalism. Yet even in collapse, the Akkadian legacy endured. The idea of empire, of a realm spanning multiple ethnicities and geographies under a single ruler, remained embedded in the Mesopotamian imagination. Akkadian, though politically diminished, continued as the language of administration and scholarship for centuries. And in temples and libraries, scribes copied the tales of Sargon and Naram-Sin, lessons in ambition, divinity, and the impermanence of power. In the next chapter, we will turn to the city of where a cultural and political renaissance would rise from the ashes of Akkad, breathing new life into the traditions of ancient Sumer. In the wake of Akkad's collapse, the lands of southern Mesopotamia lay fractured. The once glorious empire that had united Sumer and Akkad had given way to a period of instability marked by Gutian incursions and the waning influence of centralized power. Yet, from this fractured political landscape, a resurgence began, one that would breathe new life into Sumerian culture, governance, and civic organization. This rebirth is known to historians as the Ur III period, or more poetically, the Ur-III Renaissance. The city of Ur, once a prominent Sumerian settlement near the Persian Gulf, emerged as the nucleus of this revival. While the Gutians held sway for several decades, their rule lacked the administrative infrastructure necessary to govern effectively. This vacuum allowed native Sumerian leaders to rise once more, drawing from the deep well of Sumerian tradition while adapting to the new political realities of post-Akkadian Mesopotamia. Around 2112 BCE, Ur-Nammu ascended to power in Ur, founding the third dynasty of Ur, a dynasty that would not only restore order but leave a lasting legacy on human civilization. Ur-Nammu's reign was marked by both pragmatic governance and a symbolic return to Sumerian heritage. Whereas Akkadian kings had increasingly positioned themselves as divine or semi-divine figures, Ur-Nammu emphasized service to the gods and the maintenance of ma'at, balance and justice. His rule sought legitimacy not through claims of divinity, but through effective administration and piety, a shift that helped reunite the fractured Sumerian city-states under a more harmonious political order. One of Ur-Nammu's most celebrated achievements was the promulgation of what is now considered the world's first known written law code. Although fragments of earlier legal traditions likely existed, Ur-Nammu's code, preserved on clay tablets written in Sumerian cuneiform, provides the earliest surviving example of a systematic legal document. The code preceded Hammurabi's more famous Babylonian laws by over 2 centuries and established a foundation upon which later legal systems would build. The Code of Ur-Nammu was not merely a collection of punishments, but an articulation of societal values and civic expectations. It addressed issues ranging from theft and assault to marriage, slavery, and property rights. Notably, the punishments in Ur-Nammu's code were relatively moderate compared to later systems. Instead of the harsh retributive justice of an eye for an eye, it often prescribed monetary compensation for wrongdoings, a gesture toward proportional justice and civil resolution. This approach underscored a worldview in which law was meant to restore balance rather than exact vengeance. Ur-Nammu's legal reforms went hand in hand with a broader campaign of state building. He and his successors, most notably his son Shulgi, invested heavily in bureaucratic structures, record-keeping, and the standardization of weights, measures, and calendar systems. Under their guidance, the Ur-III state developed a sophisticated administrative apparatus, with scribes and officials maintaining meticulous records of labor, taxation, temple donations, and agricultural yields. These innovations helped the state manage its resources with remarkable efficiency, particularly in a land where the rhythms of river and harvest determined survival. Architecture, too, flourished during this period, with Ur-Nammu initiating the construction of monumental buildings that would define Mesopotamian religious life for centuries. Chief among these was the great ziggurat of Ur, a towering terraced temple dedicated to the moon god Nana, the city's patron deity. Rising above the flat Mesopotamian plains, the ziggurat was not only a place of worship, but a symbol of divine order rooted in earthly authority. Its design, rectilinear, ascending in layers, became a model for sacred architecture throughout the region, echoing the belief that humans could reach toward the heavens through devotion and orderly civilization. Beyond monumental temples, Ur's urban development reflected careful planning. Canals and irrigation systems were maintained to support agriculture, while granaries and storehouses ensured food distribution even in lean years. The economy was vibrant, supported by trade in grain, textiles, metals, and livestock. Artisans produced finely crafted cylinder seals, jewelry, and ceremonial items, often inscribed with praises to the king or prayers to the gods. Yet the Ur-III period was not merely a return to Sumerian tradition, it was also an evolution. While rooted in ancient cultural foundations, the dynasty demonstrated a keen awareness of the broader Mesopotamian world. The Akkadian language, still widely used, was employed in diplomacy and administration alongside Sumerian, reflecting a cosmopolitan awareness shaped by centuries of intercultural exchange. As the rule of Ur-Nammu progressed, and later under Shulgi's long and ambitious reign, the third dynasty of Ur reached an impressive level of cohesion. It succeeded in restoring stability to the region and reasserting the primacy of law and centralized power without forsaking the deeply spiritual and communal roots of Sumerian life. In the next section of this chapter, we will explore how the state under Shulgi and his successors continued to refine Mesopotamian administration, deepening the legacy of Ur-III. From standardized record-keeping to economic organization and the eventual causes of the dynasty's decline, the story of Ur's final golden age offers a compelling glimpse into one of history's earliest bureaucratic societies. Under the rule of Ur-Nammu and his successors, particularly the long-reigning Shulgi, the third dynasty of Ur reached unprecedented heights in terms of state organization. In many ways, the dynasty's power did not lie solely in military strength or conquest, but in its mastery of administrative systems. The Ur-III state became one of the most organized and documented civilizations of the ancient world, with a centralized bureaucracy that penetrated nearly every facet of life. At the core of this bureaucracy was a meticulous record-keeping system. Thousands of cuneiform tablets, preserved in archaeological finds from cities like Ur, Nippur, and Umma, reveal a world where even the most routine aspects of economic and social life were monitored and documented. These clay tablets recorded everything from livestock counts and barley distributions to labor rosters and temple donations. Scribes were essential to this process, highly trained individuals who operated the administrative machinery of the state. Their education, based in temple schools known as edubas, focused on language, mathematics, and law, ensuring that record-keeping was both accurate and standardized. To support such a vast bureaucracy, the state under Ur-III adopted a system of central planning that regulated production, distribution, and labor. Agricultural output was meticulously tallied, and resources were allocated according to seasonal cycles and religious festivals. Laborers were assigned to state-run farms, textile workshops, or temple complexes, with their rations often paid in grain or beer. The standardization of weights and measures was key to this system, allowing for consistent economic exchange across the diverse territories of the empire. Shulgi, who ruled for over 4 decades, was particularly instrumental in refining this bureaucratic model. He expanded the administrative reach of the state, building a network of provincial governors, ensi, who reported directly to the central government. A series of royal decrees helped regularize the duties of these officials, defining their roles in tax collection, infrastructure maintenance, and law enforcement. The result was a highly coordinated state apparatus, one that could manage trade routes, military garrisons, and agricultural zones with impressive efficiency. This flourishing administration was matched by a resurgence in Sumerian cultural and religious traditions, most notably exemplified by the construction of the ziggurat of Ur. Commissioned by Ur-Nammu and completed under Shulgi, this monumental structure stood as a symbolic and functional center of the city. Rising in tiers toward the heavens, the ziggurat was dedicated to Nana, the moon god, and was believed to be a divine bridge between earth and sky. Architecturally, the ziggurat reflected centuries of religious tradition, but its scale and sophistication also spoke to the resources and capabilities of the Ur-Thur state. Built from mud bricks reinforced with bitumen and baked bricks for outer layers, it was designed to endure the elements and inspire awe. Each level had its purpose: storage rooms, ritual spaces, and platforms for offerings. A temple at the summit served as the sacred dwelling for the deity, accessible only to priests and kings, reinforcing the idea that divine favor flowed through religious hierarchy and royal authority. The ziggurat was not merely a religious edifice, but also a civic landmark. It anchored the surrounding city, a space of temples, administrative buildings, markets, and residential quarters. Its presence signaled both divine protection and the state's ability to harness human labor and material to build something enduring. The return to monumental architecture was part of a broader cultural renaissance that saw the revival of Sumerian language and literature. Hymns, proverbs, and royal inscriptions were composed anew, linking contemporary rulers to ancient traditions and gods. Yet, even at its peak, the Ur-Third state faced mounting challenges. The same administrative complexity that had enabled its rise now required immense resources and careful coordination. Over time, the strain on laborers grew, especially as the state demanded increasing tribute and service. Environmental factors compounded these pressures. The southern Mesopotamian plain, always dependent on irrigation, began to suffer from salinization, an accumulation of salt in the soil due to over-irrigation, which gradually reduced agricultural yields. Economic stress followed. As food surpluses shrank, the state's ability to support its bureaucracy, military, and temple systems began to falter. Trade routes, once secured by the reach of Ur's power, became vulnerable to disruption. Simultaneously, border regions became restive. Semi-nomadic peoples from the surrounding highlands, such as the Amorites and Elamites, began encroaching on the weakened frontiers, exploiting the internal vulnerabilities of the state. By the end of Shulgi's lineage, a combination of internal unrest, economic strain, and external invasions proved too much to bear. Around 2004 BCE, the Elamites sacked Ur, marking the end of the Third Dynasty and plunging Mesopotamia into a new period of fragmentation. Still, the legacy of Ur-III endured. Its administrative sophistication, legal reforms, and architectural accomplishments became a model for future Mesopotamian civilizations. As we move forward, we turn next to the city that would inherit this legacy, Babylon, and to the ruler who would etch his name in legal history, Hammurabi. As the Third Dynasty of Ur fell into decline, Mesopotamia entered a period marked by political fragmentation and shifting power. Among the groups that rose to prominence during this time were the Amorites, a Semitic-speaking people from the West, often referred to in Sumerian texts as nomadic outsiders or tent dwellers. Gradually, these Amorites began to integrate into Mesopotamian society, settling in cities, adopting local customs, and eventually asserting political control over various city-states. One such settlement would become one of the most famous cities in human history, Babylon. Founded along the Euphrates River in what is now central Iraq, Babylon initially started as a modest town. But under the Amorites, particularly during the reign of the sixth king of the dynasty, Hammurabi, it would rise to become the political and cultural heart of Mesopotamia. Around 1800 BCE, Babylon was still one of many competing city-states, each ruled by local dynasts vying for influence. Hammurabi, who ascended to the throne around 1792 BCE, inherited a kingdom surrounded by more powerful neighbors. Yet, over the course of his reign, which lasted more than 4 decades, Hammurabi transformed Babylon into a dominant force through a combination of military strategy, clever diplomacy, and enduring legal innovation. Hammurabi's legacy is most often associated with the law code that bears his name. The Code of Hammurabi, inscribed on a tall basalt stele, topped with a relief of the king receiving the laws from the sun god Shamash, remains one of the earliest and most comprehensive legal documents ever discovered. Comprising nearly 300 laws, the code covered a vast range of civic life, theft, trade, family matters, labor, property, and civil rights. While its principle of retributive justice, famously summarized as an eye for an eye, is well known, the code also included provisions for the protection of widows, orphans, and the poor, suggesting a vision of order rooted in divine justice and royal responsibility. What made Hammurabi's code particularly revolutionary was not just its content, but its public nature. By inscribing laws in stone and placing them in temple courtyards for all to see, Hammurabi underscored the idea that the king was not merely a ruler by force, but a shepherd of justice, ordained by the gods to maintain harmony among his people. It is important to understand, however, that literacy was still limited to scribes and elites. Most people could not read these laws themselves. But the symbolism of such a display, coupled with the consistency and formality of the rules, contributed to a growing sense of civic identity and trust in the rule of law. Beyond his legislative work, Hammurabi was also a skilled diplomat and tactician. In his early years, he maintained alliances with neighboring rulers and carefully avoided open conflict. But as his position strengthened, he shifted strategy. Using a mixture of political manipulation and military force, he expanded Babylonian control over key rivals such as Larsa, Eshnunna, Mari, and eventually Ashur. One by one, these cities fell under Hammurabi's rule, bringing much of southern and central Mesopotamia into a unified realm for the first time since the Akkadian Empire. Each conquest brought not only territory but access to vital trade routes, agricultural regions, and religious centers. Hammurabi often portrayed his campaigns not as acts of aggression, but as holy missions to bring justice and order to regions plagued by chaos or impiety. He restored temples, reaffirmed local gods, and allowed some native traditions to persist, blending Amorite, Sumerian, and Akkadian customs into a broader Babylonian identity. His administration was marked by meticulous governance. Like the Ur-Thrur dynasty before him, Hammurabi relied on scribes, officials, and governors to manage provinces, collect taxes, and enforce laws. He restructured the calendar, promoted infrastructure such as canals and roads, and revived religious festivals that linked his rule to divine favor. Through these efforts, Babylon became more than just a capital. It became a symbol of Mesopotamian civilization itself. Yet, the unity Hammurabi created did not long survive his death. His successors lacked his vision and authority, and within a few generations, the Babylonian kingdom fractured once more under external pressures. Still, the memory of Hammurabi's reign, his code, his conquests, and his cultural influence endured. Later, kings and empires would look back to him as a model lawgiver and ideal sovereign. As we continue our journey through Mesopotamian history, the next chapter will turn northward to a very different kind of empire, one forged not through legal harmony, but through the relentless force of military might. The rise of Assyria would mark a new age in Mesopotamian dominance, one defined by iron, fear, and power. At the heart of Hammurabi's legal code lay one of the most iconic principles in ancient jurisprudence, lex talionis, the law of retaliation, often remembered by the phrase, an eye for an eye. Though this maxim may strike the modern ear as harsh, within the context of ancient Mesopotamia, it represented a clear departure from arbitrary punishment. It introduced a sense of proportionality in justice, wherein the penalty mirrored the offense. In a society shaped by divine law, where order and balance were essential, Hammurabi's code sought to ensure that consequences were measured, foreseeable, and rooted in divine legitimacy. Yet this wasn't justice by modern standards. The laws were deeply stratified, with punishments varying greatly based on social class and gender. If a noble injured another noble, the punishment might indeed be an eye for an eye. But if the injured party was a slave, the fine might be monetary or involve a lesser form of punishment. Similarly, if a builder's house collapsed and killed the owner's son, the builder's own son might be executed in recompense. A grim form of justice that revealed both the value placed on lineage and the collective responsibility carried by the family. Despite these inequalities, Hammurabi's law code reflected an emerging ideal. That law should be known, consistent, and rooted in a cosmic sense of fairness. The king was not a mere warlord, but a steward of divine justice, tasked with maintaining harmony between the heavens and the human world. In many of the prologues and epilogues of Hammurabi's inscriptions, he portrayed himself as a shepherd, firm but compassionate, chosen by the gods to guide his people. This was a powerful narrative shift. Justice became central to kingship. Hammurabi's Babylon, while politically dominant, was also culturally diverse. The Amorites had come from the west, but by the time of Hammurabi, they were no longer seen as outsiders. Babylon became a melting pot of older and newer Mesopotamian traditions. Sumerian culture, though its language was no longer spoken in daily life, remained sacred in temples and scholarly use. The Akkadian language, now in its old Babylonian dialect, was the language of administration and literature. The Amorites brought with them a Semitic influence that enriched both language and mythology. Rather than erasing these traditions, Babylon absorbed and reinterpreted them. Sumerian gods like Enlil and Inanna remained venerated but were now worshipped alongside Amorite deities. The pantheon was restructured, with Marduk, Babylon's chief god, rising to prominence as the supreme deity in Hammurabi's theological narrative. In myth, Marduk defeats the primordial chaos dragon Tiamat and creates order from her carcass, reflecting Hammurabi's own aspirations to subdue chaos and establish law. This cultural fusion extended to literature and education. Cuneiform remained the primary script, but scribal schools now taught a blend of Sumerian and Akkadian texts. Hymns, myths, legal formulas, and omen literature were copied and recopied by generations of scribes. Mathematics, astronomy, and medicine continued to evolve within temple complexes and administrative centers. What emerged was not a single homogeneous culture, but a layered civilization that honored its past while reshaping it under Babylonian authority. Yet, as with many empires built upon the strength and charisma of a single ruler, Babylon's cohesion proved fragile after Hammurabi's death in 1750 BCE. His successors were less capable, and the empire he forged began to unravel. Local rulers regained independence, especially in the south and north. The vital trade routes Hammurabi had secured became contested. The central authority weakened, and the political map of Mesopotamia began to fragment once again. This post-Hammurabi era was marked by a return to regionalism. City-states like Larsa, Eshnunna, and Mari reasserted autonomy. Meanwhile, new pressures emerged from outside the traditional Mesopotamian core. The Kassites, a mountain people from the Zagros region, began to infiltrate the region. Though they would later play a major role in Babylon's future, their early presence signaled the declining grasp of Amorite Babylonian rulers. Nonetheless, Hammurabi's legacy did not vanish with the fall of his dynasty. His law code continued to influence legal thought for centuries, even as new dynasties rose and fell. Future kings, even those who had no blood ties to Hammurabi, would invoke his name to legitimize their own reigns. His vision of kingship, wise, lawful, divinely sanctioned, became a model across the ancient Near East. As the spotlight shifted northward in Mesopotamia, the next great power to emerge would take a different approach. Where Hammurabi had ruled with legal precision and diplomatic skill, the Assyrians would govern with iron and fear. Their rise would reshape the region once more, ushering in a new era of empire building grounded in military might, administrative complexity, and cultural resilience. In the northern reaches of ancient Mesopotamia, nestled along the western banks of the Tigris River, lay a modest city named Ashur. Though initially overshadowed by the glittering centers of the south, Uruk, and Babylon, Ashur would become the seedbed of one of the most formidable empires the ancient world had ever known. It was not rich alluvial soil or early urban sophistication that shaped Assyria's destiny, but rather its resilience, martial spirit, and organizational genius. The city of Ashur, named after its patron deity, began as a religious and trading center around the 3rd millennium BCE. Unlike the fertile heartlands of Sumer, Assyria's landscape was more rugged and less suited to abundant agriculture. This made its inhabitants depend more heavily on trade, especially with Anatolia and the Levant, and later on, conquest as a means of acquiring wealth and securing survival. The Assyrians were influenced early on by their southern neighbors and adopted the cuneiform script and many Sumerian Akkadian cultural traditions. Yet, over time, they developed a distinct character, disciplined, militaristic, and increasingly imperial in ambition. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, Assyria began asserting itself politically. Kings such as Shamshi-Adad I, circa 1800 BCE, sought to extend Assyrian influence into neighboring territories. Though his reign was short-lived, it foreshadowed the later trajectory of Assyrian dominance, a combination of military strength administrative sophistication, and religious authority. However, after a period of stagnation and external domination by the Mitanni and Babylonians, Assyria re-emerged with renewed vigor in the early 1st millennium BCE. The true ascent of Assyria into a world power began in the 9th century BCE and reached a dramatic peak under kings like Tiglath-Pileser III and Sennacherib. These rulers transformed Assyria from a powerful regional kingdom into a vast, centrally administered empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean and deep into Egypt. Tiglath-Pileser III, who reigned from 745 to 727 BCE, was a military and administrative reformer of exceptional impact. Prior to his reign, the Assyrian Empire operated on a somewhat decentralized model, relying on vassal kings and local governors who often rebelled or failed to send tribute. Tiglath-Pileser changed this dynamic fundamentally. He reorganized the army into a standing professional force rather than a seasonal militia. Soldiers were equipped with standardized weapons, often made of iron, giving Assyria a distinct technological advantage. Iron tools and weapons, more durable and deadly than bronze, allowed the Assyrians to cut through enemy lines and fortifications with ruthless efficiency. Tiglath-Pileser's military campaigns were swift and brutal. He annexed large territories in Syria and the Levant, deported rebellious populations to break their political resistance, and installed Assyrian governors to oversee conquered provinces. These mass deportations, though cruel, were not acts of chaos but calculated strategies of control. By removing populations from their homelands and resettling them in distant corners of the empire, the Assyrians diluted local resistance and fostered dependency on the central government. His successor, Sargon II, continued these strategies, expanding Assyrian territory into the Zagros Mountains and beyond. But it was under Sennacherib, ruling from 705 to 681 BCE, that Assyrian ambition and power reached new heights and also faced fierce backlash. Sennacherib is perhaps best known for his brutal campaign against Babylon and his siege of Jerusalem in 701 BCE. In Babylon, after years of rebellion, he razed the city almost entirely, flooding it and destroying temples in a shocking show of imperial wrath. Yet this destruction also earned him the disdain of the Babylonian priesthood, and ultimately cast a long shadow over his legacy. At home in Nineveh, however, Sennacherib embarked on grand construction projects. He transformed the city into a majestic capital with wide boulevards, aqueducts, and palaces adorned with intricate bas-reliefs depicting his military victories. The palace gardens of Nineveh, irrigated by elaborate engineering, have even been considered a possible inspiration for the legendary Hanging Gardens of Babylon. These were not just architectural achievements, they were political statements, asserting the glory of Assyria and the divine favor of its rulers. Sennacherib's rule encapsulated the paradox of the Assyrian Empire. Awe-inspiring in its accomplishments, yet shadowed by fear and cruelty. The empire was built on a strict hierarchy where the king, chosen by the gods, was the absolute authority. Dissent was met with ruthless punishment. Yet, through conquest and cultural integration, Assyria spread knowledge, trade networks, and technology across the ancient Near East. By the end of Sennacherib's reign, the Assyrian Empire was unmatched in scale and power. But as history often shows, such towering heights can also presage a fall. In the chapters to follow, we'll explore how this warrior empire, so skilled in expansion, struggled to maintain the unity and peace required for enduring rule. The Assyrian Empire was not only defined by its relentless conquests, but also by the precision with which it waged war. Beyond courage and iron weaponry, what truly elevated Assyria into a superpower was its unparalleled military innovation. No other civilization in the ancient Near East matched the scale, organization, and mechanical ingenuity the Assyrians brought to the battlefield. One of the most striking contributions was their development of siege warfare. In an age when city-states and fortresses dotted the landscape, being able to breach walled defenses was a matter of strategic superiority. The Assyrians mastered this craft. They constructed massive siege engines, towering wooden structures with covered ramps that allowed soldiers to approach walls while being shielded from enemy arrows. These towers were often fitted with battering rams, operated by teams of men who pounded through fortified gates. The engineering behind these machines showed not only mechanical skill, but also logistical foresight, as they had to be constructed near battle sites, using locally sourced materials and precise measurements. Complementing these machines was the use of sappers, specialist soldiers trained to undermine walls. These men would dig tunnels beneath city defenses, sometimes filling the tunnels with flammable materials to collapse sections of walls with fire and smoke. It was not uncommon for Assyrian records to boast of how cities fell not only by force, but also through cunning engineering, an intimidation tactic in itself, designed to instill fear even before a battle began. Integral to their military dominance was the infrastructure they built to sustain it. The Assyrians developed an early system of paved roads, stretching from the imperial heartlands in Assur and Nineveh to far-flung outposts in Egypt and Anatolia. These roads were not only for merchants and travelers, they were arteries for war. Couriers could deliver messages across the empire at astonishing speed, and armies could be deployed quickly and efficiently. This logistical backbone meant that rebellions could be quashed swiftly, often before they gained momentum. Assyrian military might was not simply about equipment and engineering, it was also about fear. The empire employed brutality not as a side effect of war, but as a deliberate psychological weapon. Assyrian kings had no interest in appearing merciful. They documented their atrocities in detailed reliefs and inscriptions, sending a clear message. Resistance would not only fail, it would bring unbearable suffering. Captured cities were sometimes met with collective punishment. Rebel leaders were flayed alive or impaled on stakes, their mutilated bodies displayed along city gates or riverbanks. Populations were forcibly deported, entire families uprooted and scattered across distant provinces, destroying any hope of cohesion or rebellion. These tactics, as cruel as they seem, were methodical. By eliminating local power structures and spread-in populations, the Assyrians maintained a fragile but effective order over a multi-ethnic empire. Yet, amid this reputation for terror, the Assyrians also fostered centers of learning and culture. Nowhere is this more evident than in the city of Nineveh during the reign of King Ashurbanipal, 668 to 627 BCE, one of the last great rulers of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Though a skilled warrior, Ashurbanipal prided himself even more on being a scholar. He could read and write in several languages, including Sumerian and Akkadian, and he believed in the preservation of knowledge. Under his rule, the royal palace at Nineveh became home to what is now regarded as the first systematically organized library in human history. The library of Ashurbanipal contained over 30,000 clay tablets, meticulously catalogued and stored. These tablets covered a vast array of topics: mythology, law, medicine, astronomy, incantations, and administrative records. Among them was the complete version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which would later be rediscovered and translated in the 19th century, offering the modern world a profound window into Mesopotamian thought. The library was not only a repository of Assyrian knowledge, but also of the civilizations that came before. Ashurbanipal commissioned scribes to collect and copy texts from across the empire, preserving the cultural heritage of Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon. Ironically, it is thanks to this effort that much of our understanding of earlier Mesopotamian literature, religion, and science has survived to this day. Thus, Assyria's legacy is not merely one of conquest and cruelty, but also of innovation and intellectual preservation. The same empire that struck fear into nations also preserved the wisdom of those it conquered. Their story is a testament to the complexity of power. That strength may build through discipline and brutality, but it is the pursuit of knowledge that ensures an enduring legacy. As we move forward, the story of Assyria's downfall will begin to unfold. No empire, no matter how advanced or fearsome, is immune to time. But for now, we pause at the height of their achievements, where war engines rolled, libraries flourished, and the iron will of kings shaped the ancient world. As the Assyrian Empire faded into history, a new power emerged from the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia. This was the Neo-Babylonian Empire, sometimes called the Chaldean Empire, a final, radiant bloom of native Mesopotamian civilization before foreign dominations took hold. At its center stood a man whose name would echo through history: Nebuchadnezzar II. Ruling from 605 to 562 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar II is perhaps the most renowned of all Babylonian kings. His reign was long, militarily successful, and culturally vibrant. A member of the Chaldean dynasty that had risen in southern Mesopotamia, he inherited a kingdom that had recently thrown off the shackles of Assyrian domination under his father, Nabopolassar. But it was Nebuchadnezzar who transformed Babylon from a regional power into the jewel of the ancient Near East. Nebuchadnezzar's military campaigns were extensive. He expanded Babylonian control into Syria and Judah, clashing repeatedly with Egypt and eventually laying siege to Jerusalem, not once, but twice. The second siege in 586 BCE led to the destruction of the First Temple and the exile of many Jews to Babylon, a moment of profound consequence in Jewish history. This Babylonian captivity, as it came to be known, left deep scars and themes that would shape religious thought and scripture for centuries. But beyond conquest, Nebuchadnezzar's reign was also marked by an astonishing burst of architectural ambition. His vision for Babylon was not merely functional, it was magnificent. He reconstructed the city on a monumental scale, adorning it with temples, canals, and colossal walls. The most famous of these was the Processional Way, a grand avenue lined with vibrant blue-glazed bricks and golden depictions of lions and dragons leading toward the Ishtar Gate, an entrance so splendid that it has been partially reconstructed in Berlin's Pergamon Museum today. Yet it is the tale of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon that most captures the imagination. Counted among the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Hanging Gardens have been the subject of awe, speculation, and mystery for over 2 millennia. According to later Greek historians such as Strabo and Philo of Byzantium, the gardens were built by Nebuchadnezzar to please his wife, Amytis of Media, who longed for the green hills of her homeland. To soothe her homesickness, he supposedly ordered the construction of an artificial mountain tiered with lush greenery, exotic trees, and flowing waterfalls, suspended high above the ground. Descriptions suggest a marvel of engineering. The gardens were said to rise in terraces with massive stone platforms supporting tons of earth. Ingenious irrigation systems, possibly driven by a chain pump, supposedly drew water up from the Euphrates to keep the plants alive in the scorching Mesopotamian climate. The effect, if it truly existed, would have been breathtaking. An oasis of green suspended in the heart of a golden desert city. And yet, there is a curious absence of contemporary Babylonian records mentioning the Hanging Gardens. No surviving inscriptions from Nebuchadnezzar's time describe them, and archaeologists have yet to find definitive evidence of their location. Some scholars have even speculated that the gardens may have been confused with similar structures in Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, where King Sennacherib claimed to have created a wonder for all peoples, a paradise fed by aqueducts and mechanical devices. It is possible that Greek writers, visiting Mesopotamia centuries later, conflated stories or ascribed the wonder to the wrong king and city. Whether myth or marvel, the tale of the Hanging Gardens reflects something profound about Mesopotamian civilization at its zenith. It reveals a desire not only to dominate through force, but to create, to delight, and to elevate beauty alongside power. Even if the gardens never existed in the literal sense described by ancient tourists, they live on as symbols of human imagination and royal devotion. What is beyond doubt, however, is Nebuchadnezzar's central role in reshaping Babylon into a city of mythic grandeur. Under his rule, temples like Etemenanki, the great ziggurat dedicated to Marduk, were either constructed or restored, reinforcing the city's image as a sacred and political heart of Mesopotamia. Babylon, once again, was not just a seat of power, but a beacon of culture, religion, and splendor. As we continue this journey, we will see how this final flowering of native Mesopotamian rule faced its twilight, succumbing not to weakness, but to the rise of yet another mighty power from the east. But for now, we pause at the height of Babylon's glory, in a city where lions walked the tiled walls, and perhaps, just perhaps, gardens once hung in the air, green against the golden dust. The legacy of the Neo-Babylonian Empire is perhaps most profoundly remembered not only through its grandeur, but also through a moment of historical rupture that would reverberate for millennia: the destruction of Jerusalem and the Babylonian exile. In 586 BCE, under the command of Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylonian forces besieged Jerusalem for a second and final time. After a prolonged resistance, the city's defenses collapsed. The walls were breached, the Temple of Solomon, centerpiece of Jewish worship, was torn down, and the remaining population was either executed or deported. The cultural, religious, and psychological impact of this event was enormous. For the Jewish people, the Babylonian exile was not merely a military defeat. It represented a theological crisis. How could the chosen people be cast from their promised land? How could the temple, God's dwelling place, be desecrated by a foreign army? Yet, amid the despair, This period became one of profound spiritual and intellectual transformation. Many scholars believe that during the exile, major portions of the Hebrew Bible were compiled and edited. The themes of exile, loss, repentance, and hope found in later Jewish writings owe much to this painful chapter, and Babylon would become both a place of punishment and, paradoxically, preservation, a foreign land that became the backdrop for theological renewal. Meanwhile, within the heart of Mesopotamia, Babylon continued to thrive as one of the most dazzling urban centers of the ancient world. Under Nebuchadnezzar II's nearly half-century reign, the city was transformed into an architectural and cultural wonder. Towering walls encircled the city, so thick it was said that chariots could race along the top. These defenses weren't merely symbolic, they projected strength to both allies and enemies. The Ishtar Gate, resplendent in blue-glazed bricks and decorated with images of lions and dragons, stood as a ceremonial entrance into the inner city, leading along the grand processional way, a broad stone-paved avenue used during religious festivals and royal parades. Temples dominated the landscape, most notably the Etemenanke ziggurat, which many scholars believe inspired the biblical tale of the Tower of Babel. This massive step tower, dedicated to the god Marduk, may have reached nearly 300 feet high and stood as both a religious and political symbol of Babylon's claim to cosmic centrality. Beyond its visual splendor, Babylon was a hub of intellectual life. Astronomers and mathematicians kept detailed records of the stars, refining lunar calendars and mapping celestial movements that would influence Greek and Islamic astronomy centuries later. Legal scholars continued the Mesopotamian tradition of codifying civic life, and scribes recorded daily economic transactions on clay tablets in thriving markets that bustled with goods from as far as Egypt and the Indus Valley. Yet, as with so many empires in history, Babylon's golden age could not last forever. After the death of Nebuchadnezzar in 562 BCE, his successors proved far less capable. Political instability, court intrigue, and weak leadership left the empire vulnerable. Meanwhile, to the east, a formidable new power was rising, the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great. Cyrus had already conquered the Median and Lydian kingdoms and now turned his sights toward Babylon. In 539 BCE, he launched a campaign that would change the fate of Mesopotamia. According to both Babylonian chronicles and later Greek accounts, Cyrus entered Babylon without significant resistance. The city's defenses were said to be breached by diverting the Euphrates River, allowing his forces to slip in under the walls during a religious festival. Whether by strategy, diplomacy, or discontent within Babylon itself, the once impregnable city fell swiftly. Cyrus portrayed himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. He respected Babylonian customs and deities, presenting himself as the rightful heir to the throne of kings like Nebuchadnezzar. He allowed exiled peoples, including the Jews, to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples, an act recorded in both Persian inscriptions and the Hebrew Bible, where Cyrus is even referred to as the Anointed in the book of Isaiah. Thus, in 539 BCE, Babylon ceased to be the center of a native Mesopotamian dynasty. It became instead a jewel in the Persian crown, still important, still revered, but no longer sovereign. The fall of Babylon to Cyrus marked not just the end of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, but the conclusion of an age in which Mesopotamian peoples ruled their own lands. And yet, Babylon's legacy did not vanish. It lingered in the form of its towering ruins, in the records left behind by scribes, in the myths woven into the stories of distant civilizations. Though the Neo-Babylonian Empire was brief in historical terms, barely a century, it burned brightly, and in its flame it illuminated much of what we understand about ancient urban life, law, religion, and imperial power. In our next chapter, we turn our attention away from kings and empires to the people who lived beneath their rule, the craftsmen, traders, priests, farmers, and scholars who formed the vibrant fabric of daily life in Mesopotamia. As we shift our gaze from towering palaces and royal chronicles, the everyday life of Mesopotamian people begins to emerge with its own quiet dignity. Behind the glory of kings and empires stood millions of ordinary men and women whose routines, relationships, and ingenuity created the backbone of civilization. Family life formed the heart of Mesopotamian society. Most families lived in modest mud brick homes built tightly together along narrow alleyways, with larger compounds belonging to wealthier households. The family structure was patriarchal, with the father as head of the household. Still, women held important roles within the domestic sphere, managing the home, raising children, preparing food, and often participating in weaving or small-scale trade. Marriages were typically arranged, and legal documents, etched in cuneiform, often recorded dowries, property agreements, and inheritance clauses. Children were deeply valued, and parents placed strong emphasis on passing down household traditions, agricultural knowledge, and moral discipline. Within this social fabric, various professions sustained the economy. Craftspeople were highly respected, particularly skilled potters, metalworkers, jewelers, and weavers. Their products, intricately designed vases, bronze tools, woolen garments dyed with natural colors, filled markets and temple storehouses alike. These artisans often belonged to guilds, learning their trade through apprenticeships that began in youth. Many craftspeople worked on commission for temples or royalty, while others sold directly in bustling marketplaces. Farmers were the largest segment of the population, and their rhythm followed the cycle of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They relied on canals, dikes, and irrigation systems to water fields of barley, wheat, onions, garlic, and dates. Plows drawn by oxen turned the soil, while surplus grains were stored in granaries for both sustenance and trade. Farming was labor-intensive and depended on a delicate balance of weather and water control. Too little rain or too much flooding could mean disaster for an entire community. Herding was also common, with sheep and goats providing wool, milk, and meat. Traders were the messengers of Mesopotamian culture, linking cities and civilizations across thousands of miles. Babylonian merchants traveled as far as the Indus Valley and Anatolia, exchanging textiles, spices, ivory, lapis lazuli, and tin. Mesopotamian city-states, though often at war with one another, also depended on internal trade. Caravans loaded with jars, baskets, and textiles crossed deserts and mountains, while riverboats glided down canals carrying grains and bricks. Trade was not only economic, it was cultural, introducing foreign ideas, languages, and goods that would slowly blend with native customs. And at the heart of this industrious society pulsed a growing curiosity about the heavens, about numbers, about time. Mathematics and astronomy in Mesopotamia were not the abstract studies we know today. They were deeply practical sciences born from everyday needs, measuring fields, keeping tax records, building temples, and tracking the stars to plan for planting and harvesting. Mathematically, the Mesopotamians devised a sexagesimal base 60 system, an ingenious structure that still echoes in our 60-minute hours and 360-degree circles. They created multiplication tables, geometry principles, and even early algebraic equations. Cuneiform tablets recovered from ancient schools show students solving complex problems involving land area, weights, and merchant transactions. Astronomy, too, developed hand-in-hand with temple rituals. Priests, who were often the astronomers of the day, carefully observed celestial patterns. They tracked lunar phases, solstices, equinoxes, and the rising of planets like Venus, which held symbolic importance. Their observations led to the earliest star charts and rudimentary calendars, including the division of time into hours, days, and months. While much of their astronomy was tied to divination, interpreting eclipses or planetary alignments as omens, the precision of their calculations was remarkable for its era. Their records formed the foundation for later astronomical advances in Babylon and centuries down the line in Greek and Islamic thought. Through it all, Mesopotamians exhibited a clear understanding. To live in such a volatile land meant learning to anticipate nature's rhythms. Science was not a luxury. It was a necessity for survival. The people of ancient Mesopotamia may not have left behind sprawling monuments like the pyramids of Egypt, but they left something subtler and more enduring: systems, methods, and tools that continue to underpin human civilization. Their efforts to measure the stars, to calculate a field, to bake bricks, to balance trade, these were the quiet triumphs of everyday life. In our next chapter, we'll explore how the Mesopotamians not only measured the world around them, but also sought to explain it through myth, literature, and the immortal verses of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Mesopotamia was more than just the land of great kings and epic battles. It was, quite literally, a workshop of human progress. From the humblest farmer to the most revered scribe, innovation thrived in the minds and hands of the people. Their creations did not merely serve local needs, they laid the groundwork for much of what we consider civilization itself. Few regions in the ancient world could boast such a staggering list of firsts. Among the most celebrated of Mesopotamian innovations was the wheel. Simple in appearance, the wheel began not as a vehicle component, but as a potter's tool, dating as far back as 3500 BCE. Eventually, this technology was adapted for carts, transforming the way people and goods were transported. The solid wooden wheels, attached to axles, often reinforced with copper or bronze fittings, allowed merchants and farmers alike to move bulk goods with far greater ease than ever before. It revolutionized trade and travel, cutting journey times and enabling the growth of urban centers. Then came the plough, another profound innovation born from necessity. With its early versions made from wood and sometimes tipped with metal, the plough allowed farmers to break soil more efficiently than manual digging. Drawn by oxen, it turned earth into furrows and increased agricultural yields, especially in the heavy silt-rich soil of the river plains. This surplus in food production was not just a convenience, it was the lifeblood of urbanization. When fewer people were required to farm, others could specialize in crafts, administration, or scholarship. Waterways, too, offered promise. The sailboat, often overlooked among Mesopotamian contributions, was essential to riverine trade. As early as 3000 BCE, these crafts used simple square sails to navigate the Tigris and Euphrates. While oars remained important for maneuverability, wind power enabled longer journeys and heavier cargo loads. These early boats connected distant cities like Eridu, and Lagash, knitting together an economy that stretched across the Fertile Crescent. But even with all these physical tools, Mesopotamians may be most remarkable for their abstract innovation, the legal contract. In a world where trust needed to be formalized, cuneiform tablets became instruments of agreement. Contracts governed trade, marriage, loans, apprenticeships, and even lawsuits. These documents were witnessed, signed, often with a seal, and archived in temple or civic libraries. Their precision and detail show a society deeply committed to accountability and fairness, at least in legal structure. This brings us to the often overlooked influence of women in this ancient world. While Mesopotamia was largely patriarchal, women played meaningful roles in both religious and commercial life. In temple complexes, women served as priestesses, singers, and caretakers of sacred rituals. Some even held administrative authority over land and labor tied to temples, effectively managing resources on behalf of the gods. Commerce, too, offered women a degree of autonomy. Female merchants operated stalls, engaged in textile production, and lent silver at interest. Legal records show women signing contracts, inheriting property, and appearing in court. In fact, some families trained their daughters to be priestesses or businesswomen, allowing them social status and economic influence rare in many other ancient societies. While not egalitarian by modern standards, Mesopotamia afforded women more legal and public roles than one might assume. Education was the path to prestige, and at the heart of Mesopotamian schooling stood the scribe. Becoming a scribe was no easy task. It required years of training and discipline. Young boys, typically from elite or temple-serving families, were sent to edubus or tablet houses. There, under the watchful eyes of strict teachers, they copied lists of signs, learned grammar, practiced accounting, and memorized proverbs. Clay tablets served as their notebooks, inscribed with styluses in wet clay, then dried or baked for preservation. A common exercise might involve copying a line of text perfectly or solving a word problem involving barley rations and oxen. Errors were not taken lightly. Some school tablets include comments scolding students for laziness or poor penmanship, proof that academic frustration is as old as schooling itself. Scribes went on to become the bureaucrats, accountants, librarians, and chroniclers of the state. They recorded everything from royal decrees and temple donations to legal verdicts and astronomical observations. Their work ensured not only the smooth operation of daily life, but also the preservation of cultural memory. Without scribes, much of what we know about Mesopotamia would have been lost to time. As we close this chapter, we leave behind not just a set of tools or institutions, but the vivid impression of a civilization crafting its own destiny, line by line, brick by brick, law by law. In the next chapter, we step into the mythic realm where kings became legends, gods debated creation, and the first literary hero, Gilgamesh, sought immortality beneath Mesopotamia's ever-watchful stars. Long before ink met parchment, Mesopotamians captured their thoughts in damp river clay. The earliest impressions, pressed sometime before 3200 BCE, were simple pictographs, a stalk of barley for grain, a crude animal outline for livestock, a jar for oil. Each sign stood for a concrete thing and served a pragmatic purpose, counting temple rations, recording taxes, marking trade goods. But Mesopotamia's bustling economy and multi-layered society soon demanded more nuance than a strictly pictorial system could deliver. Administrators needed to note not just barley, but how much, of what quality, for whom, and when. Priests wished to chronicle hymns and rituals, merchants to draft contracts, scholars to track the stars. Step by step, the scribes turned pictures into symbols and symbols into sounds, unlocking the full expressive power of language on clay. The great innovation came when record keepers began to treat certain pictographs not as direct images, but as phonetic cues. A stylized head of an ox, pronounced ka in Sumerian, might stand for the sound ka wherever it occurred, in words having nothing to do with cattle. By recombining such sound signs, scribes could now depict abstract ideas, foreign names, or grammatical endings that had no obvious picture. Over centuries, the sign inventory expanded into several hundred wedge-shaped impressions, each pressed with the cut edge of a reed stylus that represented syllables rather than whole words. Hence the modern label cuneiform, from the Latin cunus for wedge. What began as a farmer's tally evolved into a full syllabary capable of preserving law codes, royal propaganda, love incantations, and epic poetry. This transformation did not happen overnight, nor was it uniform. Early dynastic tablets still mix pictographic and phonetic uses. Later, Akkadian scribes adapted Sumerian signs to their Semitic tongue, sometimes adding new wedges or combining old ones to capture guttural consonants unknown in Sumerian. Yet, despite these modifications, a trained reader from the reign of Hammurabi, 18th century BCE, could puzzle out tablets penned a millennium earlier, much as a modern reader can decipher Shakespeare with effort. The continuity is a testament to the scribal schools that guarded their craft with almost priestly discipline. Those schools flourished inside the clay-scented walls of libraries and archives. Every major city, Uruk, Lagash, Nippur, later Nineveh and Babylon, kept tablet rooms attached to temples or palaces. Shelves or clay bins held thousands of rectangular tablets, some no bigger than a playing card, others the size of a handspan. Clay was abundant and cheap. When space grew scarce, obsolete legal cases or outdated tax tallies might be recycled, watered down, kneaded, reshaped, and inscribed anew. Important texts, however, were baked hard or bitumen-coated for permanence. Catalogue tablets listed holdings by first line or subject, a system scholars deem the forerunner of library classification. Within these archives, we find lexical lists, essentially dictionaries, that standardized sign meanings and pronunciations from city to city. There are school tablets, where a teacher inscribed a line and a student copied it beneath, errors scratched out and corrected. There are astronomical diaries correlating planetary positions with market prices or royal births, revealing the Mesopotamian conviction that heaven and earth moved in synchrony. Most evocative of all are the literary tablets, myths of gods dividing the cosmos, hymns praising Inanna's descent to the underworld, wisdom dialogues, and heroic sagas. The clay tablet's durability has proved both curse and blessing. Fires that destroyed wooden structures often fired library tablets into ceramic, accidentally kiln-hardening them for posterity. Millennia later, archaeologists sifting through palace ruins at Nineveh uncovered whole rooms of tablets belonging to King Ashurbanipal's 7th century BCE collection. Though broken and scattered, many pieces could be reassembled, giving modern readers unprecedented access to Mesopotamian intellect. Where papyrus rotted in the Nile damp and parchment crumbled in European monasteries, baked clay endured under desert sands. Cuneiform's eventual decline was slow. By the Hellenistic era, Greek alphabetic scripts and Aramaic cursives offered quicker writing on parchment, and royal patronage shifted accordingly. Still, scribal families in Babylon continued copying omen texts and star catalogues into the 1st century CE. When the last temple schools closed, knowledge of the wedge signs vanished for nearly 2 millennia, only to be reborn in the 19th century through the patient decipherment of scholars like Grotefend, Rawlinson, and Hincks. In the quiet hush of a Mesopotamian library, with lamplight flickering on rows of clay, one can almost hear the stylus tapping, the low murmur of a teacher reciting, the rustle of apprentices arranging tablets by topic. That subdued industry undergirded everything from imperial diplomacy to personal prayer, and out of those same scriptoria emerged a story that would echo through the ages, the epic of Gilgamesh, whose tale of friendship, loss, and the search for meaning we shall explore in the following section. For now, let us marvel at the ingenuity that took humble river mud and turned it into the medium of civilization's earliest literature, law, and science, a written legacy pressed one wedge at a time. Within the libraries of ancient Mesopotamia, beneath layers of clay dust and time, lay a story so profound and human that it still speaks to us across 5,000 years. That story is the Epic of Gilgamesh, a masterpiece carved into cuneiform tablets that tells the tale of a king, a friend, a journey through grief, and a search for meaning in the face of death. At its heart, it is not only the world's oldest epic, but one of its most intimate reflections on what it means to live, to love, and to lose. Gilgamesh, the semi-divine king of Uruk, begins his journey as a tyrant. 2/3 god and 1/3 man, his power is unmatched, but his rule brings suffering to his people. In response to their cries, the gods create Enkidu, a wild man of the steppe, to confront Gilgamesh. What follows is not a battle of rivals, but the forging of a deep and transformative friendship. Together, the two undertake daring feats, slaying the monstrous Humbaba in the cedar forest and killing the bull of heaven sent by the goddess Ishtar. But divine wrath is not easily escaped, and Enkidu falls ill and dies. It is here, in the wake of loss, that Gilgamesh's story becomes timeless. His grief is raw, unfiltered, and immediate. He weeps, wanders, and begins a desperate quest for immortality, seeking out Utnapishtim, the Mesopotamian Noah, who was granted eternal life by the gods. Gilgamesh traverses mountains, braves the waters of death, and pleads for the secret to escape his mortal fate. But in the end, he learns the lesson that has haunted every civilization since. Death is the fate of all humans, and wisdom lies not in escaping it, but in embracing life fully and leaving behind a legacy of meaning and justice. The story closes not with triumph, but with acceptance, as Gilgamesh returns to Uruk and takes comfort in the great walls his hands have built. The epic is not only a deeply personal story, it is a window into the spiritual and mythological cosmos of Mesopotamia. Interwoven within Gilgamesh's tale and other myths found on clay tablets are broader creation narratives and cosmological beliefs. The Sumerians and Akkadians believed the universe was birthed from a primeval sea, Tiamat, and Apsu, the salt and fresh waters, merging in chaos until the gods emerged. These gods, like An, sky, Enlil, wind and authority, Enki, water and wisdom, and Inanna, love and war, each held domains but were as fallible and passionate as the humans who worshipped them. Of particular interest is the Mesopotamian flood myth, which parallels later biblical and Greek traditions. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim recounts how the gods, dismayed by humanity's noise and restlessness, decide to wipe them out with a great flood. But the god Ea whispers to Utnapishtim, who builds a massive boat, gathers animals and his family, and survives the deluge. Afterward, he releases birds to find dry land, a motif echoed in the story of Noah and the Ark in the Hebrew Bible. Scholars believe this flood myth likely stems from ancient memories of devastating river floods in the region, perhaps mythologized over generations and later absorbed into regional traditions. These stories traveled far. The myths and symbols of Mesopotamia did not vanish with its empires, they migrated across time and cultures. Hebrew texts, especially Genesis, carry echoes of Mesopotamian creation and flood stories. The concept of humans being shaped from clay, the presence of a sacred tree or forbidden knowledge, the divine punishment for hubris, all have Mesopotamian antecedents. The Garden of Eden may even find a conceptual ancestor in the Sumerian notion of Dilmun, a pure and peaceful land where sickness and death were absent. Greek mythology, too, may have borrowed themes. The hero's journey, the descent into the underworld, and the quest for immortality find early expression in Gilgamesh. Even later works, from the Roman Aeneid to Renaissance reflections on mortality, bear the fingerprints of this ancient epic. Yet what makes the Epic of Gilgamesh so enduring is not its historical influence alone, but its emotional clarity. It asks eternal questions. What does it mean to be human? How do we cope with grief? Can we defeat death or only understand it? These were not abstract queries for the people of Mesopotamia. They were woven into the rhythms of life, ritual, and prayer. When we read Gilgamesh's lament for Enkidu, or his final words to the city walls he built, we are not merely listening to a king from Uruk, we are listening to ourselves. And so, through clay and story, myth and memory, Mesopotamia left behind something even more enduring than empires, a voice in the dark, still whispering across the centuries, reminding us of our shared humanity. By the mid-6th century BCE, the once great city-states and empires of Mesopotamia had entered their twilight. The grandeur of Babylon still stood, its towering ziggurats and vibrant palaces symbols of centuries of innovation and power. But beneath the surface, political instability, shifting alliances, and economic strain had weakened its core. Into this moment of vulnerability stepped a rising force from the east, the Persian Empire, under the ambitious leadership of Cyrus the Great. In 539 BCE, without a prolonged siege or widespread bloodshed, Babylon fell to Cyrus's armies. The city gates were opened, perhaps willingly by some of its citizens, and the great imperial center of Mesopotamia was absorbed into the sprawling Achaemenid Empire. Cyrus presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. His policies were notably respectful of local traditions, religions, and governance structures. In a famous inscription known as the Cyrus Cylinder, sometimes regarded as the world's first charter of human rights, he proclaimed that he would not destroy temples or oppress the people. For Mesopotamians accustomed to conquests marked by destruction and desecration, this was a striking and strategic gesture. Under Persian rule, Mesopotamia was integrated into a highly organized imperial system. The region became part of the larger satrapy of Babylonia, governed by a satrap or provincial governor who answered directly to the Persian king. This structure allowed local customs and languages to continue while embedding the region into a vast administrative and economic network stretching from the Indus Valley to the Mediterranean. Roads, postal systems, and uniform coinage were introduced across the empire, allowing for more consistent communication and trade. Religious tolerance under the Achaemenids allowed Babylonian temples to remain active. The priests continued their rituals, and the scribes kept records in cuneiform, even as Aramaic grew in prominence as the empire's lingua franca. Though Mesopotamia was no longer the political or cultural epicenter it once was, it remained a key contributor to the Persian imperial machine, offering agricultural surplus, intellectual knowledge, and a strategic geographic position. But even the Achaemenid Empire was not eternal. In the late 4th century BCE, another figure appeared on the world stage, a man who would shake the foundations of the known world, Alexander the Great of Macedon. Driven by a vision of conquest and unity, Alexander launched a military campaign against Persia in 334 BCE. Within a few short years, he dismantled the Achaemenid Empire, city by city, battle by battle. By 331 BCE, after the decisive Battle of Gaugamela, Alexander marched triumphantly into Babylon. The city, its walls still standing, its temples still active, welcomed him. The young Macedonian king, like Cyrus before him, adopted the persona of a respectful ruler. He performed sacrifices to Babylonian gods, consulted local priests, and even ordered repairs to the ancient ziggurat of Etemenanke, long in disrepair. For a time, Babylon seemed poised to regain its former glory under this new, unexpected patron. Yet Alexander's rule was brief. He died in 323 BCE in the very palace of Nebuchadnezzar II in Babylon at the age of just 32. His death unleashed a struggle among his generals for control of his empire. Mesopotamia passed into the hands of the Seleucid dynasty, part of the broader Hellenistic world now shaped by Greek language, thought, and art. The transition to Hellenistic rule brought both continuity and change. Greek cities like Seleucia on the Tigris were established, serving as administrative centers and hubs of trade. Greek became the dominant language of governance, and elements of Greek culture blended with ancient Mesopotamian traditions. Statues of Zeus stood near temples of Marduk, and new philosophical ideas mingled with centuries-old myths. Yet in this fusion, something began to fade. The old scribal schools, once the guardians of cuneiform learning, struggled to maintain their relevance. Fewer students learned to read the thousands of signs necessary to master the ancient script. Temples that had once commanded armies and advised kings found themselves increasingly sidelined. As the Hellenistic age advanced, the heartbeat of Mesopotamian identity, its language, its writing, its sense of cosmic order, began to dim. Still, memory endured. The myths, rituals and innovations of Mesopotamia lived on in transformed ways, preserved in the writings of Greek historians, the practices of Persian administrators, and the stories passed down across generations. The transition from native Mesopotamian rule to foreign empire did not erase its legacy. It carried it forward into new forms, scattered like clay fragments across the pages of history. In this great turning of the ages, from Sumer to Akkad, from Babylon to Persia, from Persia to Greece, Mesopotamia did not vanish. It evolved, absorbed, and whispered on. Its rivers still flowed, its walls still stood, and its spirit, though hidden beneath layers of empire, continued to shape the course of civilization. Even under successive foreign rulers, a thread of continuity bound Mesopotamia to its earliest past. The hum of tablets being pressed, the low chants drifting from ancient sanctuaries, the steady rhythm of irrigation that coaxed grain from the alluvial plains. Yet, decade by decade, that thread thinned. Aramaic, favored first by the Achaemenids for its simplicity and broad intelligibility, spread through markets and courts. Greek, championed by the Seleucids, followed in its wake, becoming the language of philosophy, science, and imperial administration. Native tongues, literary Sumerian and everyday Akkadian, receded to the temple precincts and scribal academies, spoken now by priests, scholars, and a dwindling circle of students who still memorized thousands of wedge-shaped signs. Temples, once powerhouses of both economy and statecraft, likewise lost influence. Hellenistic and later Parthian and Roman governors taxed them, curtailed their estates, or installed new cults alongside the old. The city of Uruk still maintained its colossal ziggurat, but its resident clergy had fewer resources to stage the grand festivals that once reaffirmed the bond between gods and king. In Babylon, the Esagila complex to Marduk remained a potent symbol. Yet with each generation, fewer pilgrims arrived, and fewer royal edicts flowed in to finance its upkeep. Religion persisted, but it did so within a landscape where political authority, revenue, and cultural prestige were drifting elsewhere. By the 1st century BCE, cuneiform tablets already speak of rarity. Scribes note difficulty acquiring students. Temple workshops lament shortages of trained artisans able to inscribe foundation cones or astronomical diaries. The knowledge system that had guided agriculture, managed trade expeditions, and charted the skies since the 3rd millennium was becoming esoteric, preserved for tradition's sake more than daily utility. When the Parthians yielded Mesopotamia to Rome in 116 CE, briefly and definitively in the 2nd century, Latin joined the chorus of tongues, yet even Roman commanders treated cuneiform as a curiosity, an antique relic of a world long past. Around 75 to 100 CE, the last dated astronomical tablets appear at Uruk, their walls recording planetary positions in formulas refined over centuries. Shortly afterward, the doors of the scribal Esh-Galu school closed. No single decree ended cuneiform, no conqueror smashed the styluses. Rather, the final apprentices simply did not come. Clay libraries were left to dry and crumble, buried by silt from successive spring floods. When the scholar Aelius Aristides wrote admiringly of Babylon in the 2nd century, he spoke of towering ruins and windswept precincts, a silent witness to civilizations whose voices were now muted. Yet silence is not oblivion. Mesopotamian mathematics, relayed through Greek intermediaries, provided sexagesimal principles, the 60-based counting still ticking in every minute and every circle's 360 degrees. Mesopotamian astronomy, refined by Babylonian skywatchers, underpinned the tables later used by Hipparchus and Ptolemy, shaping medieval Islamic and European cosmology. Legal concepts embedded in the Code of Hammurabi, contracts, witness testimony, scaled reparation, echoed in Mosaic law, Roman jurisprudence, and ultimately the civil codes of the modern world. Flood epics and primeval gardens, carried along trade routes and through exilic memories, resurfaced in Hebrew scripture and through it permeated Christian and Islamic traditions. Architectural DNA also endured. The stepped silhouette of the ziggurat inspired the terraced temples of Elam, the pyramidal towers of Mesoamerica, via independent invention yet eerily parallel form, and in abstracted translation the tiered bell towers and minarets that would later punctuate Near Eastern skylines. Urban planning lessons, orthogonal streets, canal grids, defensive walls bent to rivers, travelled with engineers across Persia and into Alexander's new foundations, then through Roman military camps that seeded Europe's future cities. Culturally, Mesopotamia's legacy entwined with its conquerors. The Persian notion of divine kingship absorbed Babylonian ritual. Greek philosophical schools preserved fragments of Chaldean star lore. Syriac Christian scholars in late antiquity copied and glossed bits of Assyrian medicine. Even as the original languages fell quiet, translation became transmission. In this way, Mesopotamia was never a vanished civilization, only a civilization in constant diffusion, its ideas seeded far beyond the floodplain. By the early Islamic era, 7th–8th centuries CE, Arab scholars encountered the shattered libraries of Nineveh and Babylon with wonder. They called the mysterious wedge impressions Mikhtutat Kufiya, Kufic writings. Though they could not read them, they sensed antiquity's weight and preserved many tablets in new archives at Baghdad. Centuries later, in the 19th century, European travelers and local Iraqi laborers unearthed these same baked clay texts, allowing scholars like Rawlinson, Layard and Hincks to crack the code of cuneiform, rebirthing voices silent for 2,000 years. In museums from London to Istanbul, from Berlin to New York, the tablets now speak again, telling of barley rations and eclipses, of hymns to Ishtar and love letters etched in clay. Thus, the arc of Mesopotamia bends not to disappearance, but to transformation. Like the lingering scent of reeds after the river recedes, its influence remains, diffuse yet pervasive, subtle yet foundational. Each time we glance at a wristwatch divided into 60 minutes, study a contract notarized and sealed, contemplate a flood myth, or plot a chart in base 60 geometry, we trace faint lines back to scribes in mud-brick rooms beside the Euphrates. In the quiet hours of history, Mesopotamia's temples may have closed, and its languages may have fallen still, but its pulse continues in the shared heritage of law, science, myth, and city life. The land between two rivers taught humanity how to write, to rule, to record the heavens, and to imagine gods who walk among mortals. Those lessons, once pressed into wet clay, remain pressed into the foundations of our modern world, an enduring murmur from the cradle of civilization. When we look back across the long arc of civilization, few ancient societies have left as enduring a legacy as that of Mesopotamia. Nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, it was here, thousands of years before the Common Era, that the first seeds of ordered human society took root. But these weren't just rudimentary beginnings. From Mesopotamia came foundational ideas that would echo through millennia, shaping law, religion, science, timekeeping, and the written word itself. The influence of Mesopotamian law is most famously exemplified by the Code of Hammurabi, etched into stone around 1750 BCE. This early legal document did more than dictate rules and punishments. It offered a glimpse into a society deeply invested in justice, order, and structure. An eye for an eye is often cited, but within those clauses also lay sophisticated provisions for contracts, trade, inheritance, divorce, and property disputes. Concepts such as presumption of innocence, state arbitration, and compensation for injury have parallels in later Roman law and still echo in modern legal systems across the globe. The very notion of a written code as a stabilizing tool for governance is a Mesopotamian innovation that underpins our understanding of constitutional order today. Mesopotamian religion, too, left a deep mark. Their pantheon of gods, An, Enlil, Inanna, Marduk, may not be worshipped today, but the shape of their mythologies carved channels through which later religious ideas would flow. The flood narrative from the Epic of Gilgamesh, in which a man is warned by a god to build a boat and save animals from a divine deluge, predates and closely parallels the story of Noah found in the Hebrew Bible. Creation myths featuring chaos waters, divine breath, and formed humanity resonate not only in the Old Testament but in other ancient traditions as well. The theological structure of divine authority, heavenly judgment, and sacred law originates in part from Mesopotamian religious thought. The realm of astronomy and timekeeping likewise owes a profound debt to Mesopotamian innovation. Babylonian astronomers developed a base 60 or sexagesimal number system to chart the movements of celestial bodies. From this mathematical foundation came our modern division of the hour into 60 minutes and the circle into 360 degrees, concepts that structure everything from GPS systems to classroom geometry. These early skywatchers observed the paths of planets, predicted eclipses, and created complex star charts that informed both ritual calendars and agricultural planning. The division of time into weeks, the association of celestial bodies with days, e.g., Monday for the moon, and the identification of constellations all trace their lineage to Babylonian stargazers who looked up at the heavens from clay-roofed ziggurats. Writing itself, arguably the most transformative invention of all, began here. Cuneiform script, evolving from simple pictographs, allowed human thought to leave behind the fleeting air of speech and take permanent form in clay. This innovation unlocked the ability to record contracts, myths, histories, and observations, making knowledge something that could be accumulated, reviewed, and passed through generations. It enabled complex economies, bureaucracies, and systems of education, and it provided the first means by which a civilization could speak to the future. Perhaps most subtly yet powerfully, Mesopotamia's worldview has echoed into philosophical and moral traditions across cultures. In both the Bible and the Quran, we find allusions to Mesopotamian cities, rulers, and events. The Tower of Babel, for instance, is believed by many scholars to be inspired by the Etemenanki ziggurat in Babylon, a symbol of hubris punished by divine fragmentation. The exile of the Jews in Babylon and their exposure to its libraries and myths contributed to the shaping of post-exilic Judaism. Concepts of sin, law, divine kingship, and even the afterlife bear the imprint of Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian thought systems. Greek thinkers like Pythagoras and Plato encountered Babylonian knowledge through cross-cultural contact with the Near East. The astronomical wisdom compiled in cities like Ur and Nineveh informed Hellenistic science, which in turn shaped Roman, Islamic, and eventually Renaissance thought. The very idea of recording knowledge for the sake of future understanding, a core tenet of science and scholarship, can be traced back to clay tablets kept in Mesopotamian temple libraries. The echoes of Mesopotamia, then, are not faint. They reverberate in courtrooms and clocks, in scripture and skylines, in alphabets and algorithms. It is a legacy not defined by monuments alone, but by patterns of thought and structure that guide the modern world. From the steady laws that govern societies, to the unseen cycles of time that shape our days, to the very act of writing these words, it is Mesopotamia we hear, whispering through history. As the centuries passed, the mighty cities of Sumer, Babylon, and Assyria were gradually buried by the sands of time. Their temples crumbled, their languages faded, and their once bustling streets fell silent. But silence is not absence. Deep beneath modern Iraq and its neighboring lands, remnants of the world's first civilization waited patiently, preserved in clay, stone, and memory. It would take the curiosity, courage, and persistence of modern archaeology to bring them back into the light. The rediscovery of Mesopotamia began in earnest during the 19th century. European explorers, driven by biblical references and classical accounts, journeyed to the ruins along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. In 1843, French consul Paul-Émile Botta began excavating at Khorsabad, uncovering the lost city of Dur-Sharrukin, capital of the Assyrian king Sargon II. Not long after, British archaeologist Austin Henry Layard made groundbreaking discoveries at Nimrud and Nineveh, including the famed library of Ashurbanipal, a collection of more than 30,000 clay tablets that offered a window into Assyrian knowledge, governance, and mythology. In the south, the ruins of Babylon and Ur began to give up their secrets. German archaeologist Robert Koldewey spent almost 2 decades uncovering Babylon's vast architectural wonders, including the famed Ishtar Gate, its blue-glazed bricks still vivid after thousands of years. Excavations at Ur, led by British archaeologist Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, revealed royal tombs filled with golden lyres, elaborate headdresses, and offerings for the afterlife. It was in Ur that Woolley unearthed a structure believed to be the ziggurat of Ur-Nammu, rising in solemn, stepped grandeur toward the sky, a testament to the architectural ambitions of Sumerian society. These discoveries did more than fill museum halls. They rewrote human history. For the first time, scholars were able to piece together the daily life, spiritual beliefs, technological innovations, and administrative systems of a civilization long considered mythical. The decipherment of cuneiform, beginning with the trilingual Behistun inscription decoded by Henry Rawlinson, allowed the ancient voices of scribes, kings, and priests to be read once more. Mesopotamia emerged not as a shadowy precursor to Egypt or Greece, but as a foundational culture in its own right, one whose contributions shaped the very structure of human civilization. And what of the cities themselves? From the baked bricks of Uruk to the wide avenues of Babylon, Mesopotamian city planning continues to resonate. The concept of the city as an organized, sacred, and administrative hub began here. Ziggurats, massive stepped structures that reached toward the heavens, were both temples and centers of civic identity. Each city-state had its patron deity, its protective walls, its central market, and its carefully engineered canals and granaries. These were not haphazard settlements, but highly intentional urban experiments. Today, we see echoes of these ancient urban innovations in our own cityscapes. The division of neighborhoods by function, commercial, residential, religious, can be traced to early Mesopotamian planning. Infrastructure like roads, water channels, and flood control systems were developed to serve growing populations and are mirrored in our modern concerns with sustainability and civic design. Even the notion of vertical architecture, expressed in the tiered majesty of ziggurats, finds its distant descendant in the skyscraper, a symbolic reaching toward the heavens, blending utility and aspiration. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of Mesopotamia is not found in stone or script, but in the persistent whisper of its ideas. Though the civilization itself fell, its foundational concepts live on. The notion of codified law, the division of time into hours and minutes, the recording of knowledge, the reverence for the stars, the symbolic power of the written word, all of these began under Mesopotamian skies. Their worldview, one that linked the mortal and the divine, the ordered city and the chaotic wilderness, continues to shape how we see ourselves and our place in the universe. Even now, as archaeologists work with satellite imaging and digital modeling to locate lost cities, the Mesopotamian past continues to surprise and inform us. New discoveries emerge from the earth each year: temples, seals, tablets, each offering a fresh thread in the tapestry of human memory. And in libraries and classrooms, the story of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria is told and retold, not as relics of a forgotten world, but as ancestors of our own. In the hush of bedtime, when the day recedes and thoughts stretch towards something timeless, it is fitting to listen for the voice of the first civilization. It speaks in cuneiform marks pressed into clay. It rises with the bricks of ziggurats and the cadence of ancient hymns. It drifts with the waters of the Tigris and Euphrates and hums beneath the asphalt of our modern streets. Mesopotamia, first to build, first to write, first to dream, still whispers through time.